James Stewart stood up from the table and walked away the moment Dean Martin sat down, leaving his coffee still steaming and 40 people staring in frozen silence. Remember this moment because 3 days later in a canyon outside Tucson, Jimmy would be begging this same man not to let go of his hand. The year was 1962, and Dorado Pictures had just made the announcement that sent every entertainment columnist in America scrambling for their typewriters. Dean Martin and James Stewart would star together in a Western called Red Canyon. The studio was convinced they had struck gold. Two of the biggest names in Hollywood, one film. What could possibly go wrong? Everything, as it turned out. The first sign of trouble came during the initial table read at Stage 7 in Burbank. Dean arrived 15 minutes early, which surprised everyone who knew his reputation. He wore a casual sport coat, no tie, and carried that easy confidence that made him famous. He was cracking jokes with the lighting guys, asking the script supervisor about her kids, being Dean, that effortless charm that made people feel like they had known him for years. Then James Stewart walked in, right in the comments. Where are you listening to this story from, and what time is it right now? Jimmy moved through the room like a man on a mission, shaking hands with the director, nodding at the producers, greeting crew members he recognized from previous pictures. His path through the room was deliberate, calculated, and it curved around Dean Martin like water flowing around a stone. Not once did he look in Dean's direction. Not once did he acknowledge that the man even existed. Dean noticed. Of course he noticed, but he just smiled that famous smile and turned back to his conversation with the gaffer. Maybe Jimmy was having a bad day. Maybe he was focused on the work. Dean had been in this business long enough to know that not everyone wanted to be best friends on set. But then came the table read. The director, a veteran named Harold Crane, who had worked with both men separately, arranged the seating so that Dean and Jimmy would be across from each other. It made sense for the blocking discussions that would follow. Their characters were supposed to be rivals who become reluctant partners. Eye contact would be important. Jimmy took one look at the seating arrangement, picked up his script, and moved to the far end of the table. 12 seats away from Dean Martin. The room went quiet. Harold Crane opened his mouth to say something, then closed it. The producers exchanged glances. Dean just stared at the empty chair across from him, and for a brief moment something flickered across his face that wasn't part of any performance. Now you need to understand something about Dean Martin that most people got wrong. The drinking, the stumbling, the slurred words on stage. It was an act, always had been. Dean was one of the most disciplined performers in the business. He showed up, prepared, knew his lines cold, and never once caused a delay on any picture he made. The drunk routine was a character, a mask, a way of making the audience feel comfortable while he worked his magic. But James Stewart didn't know that. Or maybe he did, and it didn't matter. Look at what happened over the next week of pre-production. Every time Dean entered a room, Jimmy found a reason to leave. When Dean sat in the makeup chair, Jimmy would suddenly need to make a phone call. When Dean was rehearsing his lines with the dialogue coach, Jimmy was on the other side of the lot, running scenes with his stand-in. It was a masterpiece of avoidance, so perfectly executed that it almost seemed choreographed. The crew started talking, whispers in the commissary. Theories exchanged during smoke breaks. Some said it was professional jealousy, two leading men competing for the same spotlight. Others claimed there was bad blood from some party years ago that nobody could quite remember the details of. A few suggested that Jimmy, the serious dramatic actor with the sterling reputation, simply looked down on Dean as a lightweight crooner playing at being a movie star. None of them were right. The truth was something else entirely, and Dean was determined to find out what it was. His chance came on the 4th day of rehearsals. They were blocking a scene in the saloon set, the one where their characters first meet. The director needed both of them at the bar for the camera setup. Jimmy couldn't avoid this one. They would have to stand 3 feet apart. Dean watched Jimmy approach the bar. He saw the tension in those famous shoulders, the way Jimmy's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and then Dean did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He stepped back. He gave Jimmy space. He didn't try to make conversation. He didn't crack a joke to ease the tension. He simply did his job, hit his marks, delivered his lines with professional precision, and treated James Stewart with the same quiet respect you might show a stranger on a train who clearly wanted to be left alone. The scene went perfectly. One take. Notice how Jimmy looked at Dean when the director called "cut," just for a second. A flicker of something that might have been confusion, or might have been the first crack in whatever wall he had built. But then the wall went back up, and Jimmy was gone before Dean could even think about what that look might have meant. That night, Dean made some phone calls. He talked to directors who had worked with Jimmy. He talked to actors who knew him from the old days. He talked to anyone who might have a piece of the puzzle. And slowly, a picture began to emerge. James Stewart had lost someone. A close friend, maybe closer than a friend, to alcohol. The details were vague. This was Hollywood, where secrets were currency and everyone knew how to keep their mouths shut. But the shape of the tragedy was clear enough. Someone Jimmy loved had drunk themselves to death, and the wound was still fresh enough to bleed. And here was Dean Martin, famous for the drink in his hand and the slur in his voice, playing a character that Jimmy's broken heart couldn't separate from the man who had destroyed someone he cared about. Stop for a moment and think about that. Put yourself in that makeup trailer, in that rehearsal room, in that commissary. Every time Jimmy looked at Dean, he saw a ghost. Every joke about booze, every staged stumble, every clink of ice in a glass. It was salt in a wound that hadn't even begun to heal. Dean sat alone in his trailer that night, cigarette burning down to his fingers, and made a decision. The next morning he arrived on set without the character. No jokes about needing a drink to face the day, no pretend stumbles, no playing drunk between takes for laughs. He was just Dean, quiet, professional, present. Jimmy noticed, the whole set noticed, but nobody said anything. 3 days passed like this. Dean played it straight, gave Jimmy his space, and focused entirely on the work. The scenes they shot together were starting to crackle with something unexpected, a tension that felt real, that felt earned, that the cameras were eating up, but they still hadn't spoken a single word to each other, off camera. Not one. Then came the canyon. Listen to what happened next, because this is where everything changed. The location shoot was scheduled for a place called Red Wall Canyon, about an hour outside Tucson. The script called for a chase sequence along the rim, a fight on a narrow ledge, and a climactic moment where Dean's character saves Jimmy's character from falling to his death. Standard Western stuff. The stunt coordinators had been planning it for weeks, but the night before the shoot, the weather turned. A storm rolled through the canyon country, dumping rain that no one had predicted. By morning, the skies had cleared, but the damage was done. The trails were slick, the rocks were unstable. The safety coordinator was already on the phone with the producers, recommending they postpone. The producers said no. They were already over budget. The schedule couldn't slip. They would shoot around the dangerous stuff and save the ledge sequence for another day. Harold Crane gathered the cast and crew at base camp and explained the adjusted plan. They would shoot the dialogue scenes on table ground, get the wide shots of the canyon for backgrounds, and skip anything that required the actors to get near the edge. Jimmy listened to this with visible relief. Dean noticed. The morning went smoothly. They shot the approach to the canyon, the moment where the two characters spot each other across the desert, the tense confrontation that was supposed to lead to the chase. The sun was brutal, the dust was everywhere, but both men delivered exactly what the director needed. Then, during the lunch break, everything went wrong. Remember the ledge they weren't supposed to go near? The safety coordinator had flagged as unstable after the storm. It was maybe 200 yards from base camp, roped off with warning signs that nobody was supposed to ignore. Jimmy ignored it. Wait. Before you ask why, you need to understand something about James Stewart that the public rarely saw. Behind that aw-shucks persona, behind the stammering everyman routine, there was a man who had flown 20 combat missions over Nazi Germany, a man who had seen friends die in burning aircraft, a man who dealt with fear by walking straight into it, because that was the only way he knew how to prove it didn't own him. The unstable ledge was calling to him, not because he wanted to die, because he needed to prove to himself that he wasn't afraid. He told no one where he was going. He ducked under the rope and walked out toward the edge, while everyone else was eating sandwiches and complaining about the heat. Dean saw him go. He didn't think. He didn't call for help. He just followed. The ledge was worse than anyone had realized. The storm had undercut the rock in ways that weren't visible from above. Jimmy was standing on a shelf that was already starting to separate from the canyon wall, hairline cracks spreading beneath his boots like a web. He didn't know. He was looking out at the view, lost in whatever thoughts had driven him out there in the first place. Dean stopped about 20 feet back, where the rock still felt solid. He could see the cracks. He could see the slight tilt of the ground that Jimmy was standing on. He could see exactly how bad this was about to get. And then the ledge gave way. Notice how fast it happened. Man, 1 second Jimmy was standing there, the next he was falling, arms pinwheeling, a sound coming out of his throat that didn't sound like anything Dean had ever heard from a human being. But the fall wasn't clean. The ledge collapsed in pieces, and Jimmy managed to grab onto a jutting rock about 15 feet down. He was hanging there, feet dangling over nothing, fingers white-knuckled on stone that might not hold. Dean was moving before he made the conscious decision to move. He was on his stomach at the edge of the break, reaching down into the dust and chaos, screaming for Jimmy to hold on. Their eyes met. For the first time since this whole nightmare started, James Stewart looked directly at Dean Martin, and there was no wall, no avoidance, no ghost standing between them. There was just a man about to die and another man trying to save him. Jimmy's grip was slipping. The rock he was holding was coming loose. Dean could see it starting to pull away from the canyon wall. He didn't have time to go for help. He didn't have rope. He didn't have anything but his own body, and maybe 10 seconds before Jimmy fell. So Dean did the only thing he could do. He grabbed Jimmy's wrist with both hands and braced himself against the broken edge of the ledge, and he held on. The weight was impossible. Dean could feel his shoulders, screaming, his grip sliding on the sweat and dust that covered Jimmy's skin. The broken rock was cutting into his chest and stomach. He could hear shouting from somewhere behind him. The crew had finally noticed something was wrong, but they were too far away. They wouldn't make it in time. It was just Dean, just his hands, just his refusal to let go. Jimmy looked up at him, and in that moment hanging between life and death, he finally spoke. His voice was barely a whisper, just one word, one name. Patricia. Dean didn't understand, but he filed it away, locked it in his memory, and kept holding on. The rescue team arrived 90 seconds later, 90 seconds of Dean's muscles burning, his grip failing, his vision starting to blur from the strain, 90 seconds of Jimmy's weight trying to drag them both into the canyon, 90 seconds of two men who had never spoken, holding on to each other like their lives depended on it, because one of their lives did. They pulled Jimmy up first, then helped Dean away from the edge. Both men collapsed on solid ground, covered in dust and blood from a dozen small cuts, breathing like they had just run a marathon. The crew was in chaos. Someone was calling for a medic. Someone else was already on the radio to the producers. Harold Crane was standing there with his mouth open, unable to process what he had just witnessed. But Dean wasn't paying attention to any of that. He was watching Jimmy. James Stewart was lying on his back, staring up at the Arizona sky, and tears were cutting tracks through the dust on his face. Not from the fear, not from the pain, from something else, something that had been locked inside him for longer than anyone knew. Dean crawled over to him. His arms felt like they might fall off. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely control them, but he made it to Jimmy's side. and he sat there in the dirt. And he waited. When Jimmy finally spoke, his voice was raw. "She was my sister." Dean said nothing. He just listened. "Patricia. She was 5 years younger than me. Sweetest person you ever met. Never had a mean word for anyone. And she married a man who seemed perfect until he wasn't, until the bottles started piling up, until he couldn't stop, until one night he got behind the wheel and took her with him into a telephone pole at 60 miles an hour. Jimmy turned his head and looked at Dean. "Every time I see a drink in someone's hand, I see his face. Every time I hear someone slur their words, I hear the way he sounded that last phone call when he promised me he was getting better. I know it's not fair. I know it's not rational. I know you're not him." He paused. "But God help me. I couldn't look at you without wanting to scream." Dean sat with that for a long moment. The crew was keeping their distance now, sensing that something important was happening. The desert wind had picked up, carrying away the dust and the tension and maybe some of the grief. Then Dean spoke. "I don't drink." Jimmy blinked. "The whole thing," Dean continued. "The stumbling, the slurring, the glass in my hand. It's apple juice. Always has been. It's a character. It's a bit. It's the guy the audience expects to see, so I give him to them." He looked at Jimmy with eyes that held no performance, no mask, no showmanship. "I've seen what the real thing does to people, lost a few friends myself along the way. I could never. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Jimmy stared at him for a long time. Something was shifting behind those famous blue eyes. Some tectonic plate of grief and anger and misplaced blame finally moving into a new position. Then slowly, James Stewart started to laugh. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the kind of laugh that comes when you've been carrying something impossibly heavy and someone finally helps you set it down. It was exhaustion and relief and something that might have been the beginning of healing. Dean started laughing too. 2 men covered in blood and dust, lying on the edge of a canyon, laughing like idiots at the absurdity of everything. If you enjoyed spending this time here, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. A simple like also helps more than you'd think. They finished the picture. Of course they did. But something had changed. The scenes they shot after that day had a different quality, a warmth, an understanding, a chemistry that jumped off the screen. The movie became one of the biggest westerns of that year, and critics couldn't stop talking about the remarkable relationship between the 2 leads. What they didn't know was what had been built in those 90 seconds on the canyon's edge. What they didn't know was the lunch they shared every day for the rest of the shoot, the stories they traded, the friendship that grew in the space where suspicion used to live. On the last day of filming, Jimmy gave Dean a gift. A small wooden box, hand-carved, with the inscription on the inside of the lid, "For the man who held on." Dean kept that box on his desk for the rest of his career. He never told anyone where it came from. He never explained what it meant. Some things are too important to share with the whole world. They made 2 more pictures together over the next decade, and every time they walked on set, Jimmy would find Dean at the coffee station, sit down across from him and stay. No more walking away. Some say they can still hear them laughing on quiet nights in the canyons outside Tucson. 2 men who proved that sometimes it takes almost dying to start really living. And if you ever get the chance to watch Red Canyon, pay attention to the scene where they pull each other up from the ledge. There's one shot, just a few seconds, where you can see the real Dean and the real Jimmy reaching for each other. Look at their eyes. That's not acting. The canyon keeps its secrets, but now you know this one.